Hello everyone and welcome to this next review for Non-Things by Byung-Chul Han. Now, I wasn't actually originally going to review this book because I'd already covered Han's book on the dev drive. But the more I read this, the more I realised it was so utterly relevant to my interests that I felt that I had to review it. It really belongs on this channel. And in fact, I would say that this book is probably a counterpart to Curry's book on enchantment and wonder in modern life. It's a very short book, but filled with information. It's dense, in fact. It requires a slow read, I think. Especially Hans, including people like Heidegger, Derrida, Adorno, Deleuze and Guattari, people like this. It's Hegel as well. It's a lot to take in. Absolutely fascinating though, and I found that on every page I was scribbling notes and making little diagrams and things. I love this type of book where I can just fully get on board with it, almost fully. I might get into some reasons why I don't quite agree with Han in certain places, but this book is fantastic, and it's really a follow-on, I think, for me from Han's book on the dev drive. Indeed, he does cover some of the things that he covered in the dev drive, but I would say more fully. I actually enjoyed this book a lot more than the dev drive for a variety of reasons, but that aside, we're going to, as always, start with the back of the book. We no longer inhabit the earth and dwell under the sky. These are being replaced by Google Earth and the cloud. The terrestrial order is giving way to a digital order. The world of things is being replaced by a world of non-things, a constantly expanding infosphere of information and communication, which displaces objects and obliterates any stillness and calmness in our lives. The back of the book goes on to say that, and as we become increasingly absorbed in the infosphere, we lose touch with the magic of things which provide a stable environment for dwelling and give continuity to human life. Some of you may know my main interest, or concern rather, is the diminishment of worldliness. And by worldliness I don't mean the accumulation of material wealth. I mean losing that sense of the world being a beautiful and storied world, that we live in this. We need to be connected to the past. We need to see ourselves reflected in the best way in our architectures, for example, our surroundings. We need to be, I suppose you can think of it as, we experience meaning in terms of islands. We need to go out to, for most of us, we need to go out to islands, woodland islands that are constantly shrinking. Or churches even, to get a sense of connectedness to the past and to beauty as well, if you're that way, and even if you're not that way inclined. We see ourselves only reflected in shop windows, and everything seems to be becoming more sterile and cold, especially in globalist skyscraper cities. Everything is becoming more machine-like and more focused on proficiency, and I think that's my main interest, really. I suppose you can summarize it as the proliferation of non-places and non-things. We need a sense of the biological and the historical and everything that makes human life worth living. A locus for non-things would be New York's Times Square. I've talked about this on the channel before quite often. Really a place of non-things. It's called the crossroads of the world. It's anything but. And this relates to something that Han says at the very start of the book in the preface. He says that information creates the illusion of a series of events. Information feeds off our attraction towards surprise. Think about the advertisements constantly blinking everywhere, things pulling you towards them, and really only being fit for the human, consumer goods and things like this. It's not looking towards the other. It's feeding off human desires. Information feeds off our attraction towards surprise, but the attraction does not last long. Soon there's a need for a new surprise. We are now in the habit of perceiving reality in terms of attraction and surprise. As information hunters, we are becoming blind to still inconspicuous things, to what is common, the incidental and the customary, the things that do not attract us but ground us in being. And Hans says that the world is becoming increasingly intangible, cloud-like and ghostly. There are no tangible and arrestable things. Things stabilise human life insofar as they provide a continuity. Could not agree more with Han's thinking throughout this book, but I will say that there are times when it seems as if he almost seems to just have an overt suspicion of anything new. I have to say, it does get to that point at certain times. He feels almost a sense of him being threatened by the new. He says that he has no time for computer games and he has no time for screens, whereas I don't see it like that. It has to be more nuanced, and there's a lot of nuance to this book, but obviously you'll be aware that I find a lot of value in engaging with computer games and representations of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be this this chair or this pocket watch or this jukebox, which is, he has an essay on the jukebox and the wonder of the jukebox, and or this this fireplace. It can be the digital, because the digital, the representation can awaken a sense of wonder if viewed in the right way. But that aside, I do agree with his idea that we have become increasingly focused on information, on transparency. We want everything to be presented to us, controllable, relating to the disenchantment narrative, Curry and Weber and people like this. Everything needs to be efficient, and there needs to be a sense for us in the modern age that everything is presented towards us, fully visible, fully available, and controllable. We see things in terms of access. We don't live in a world in which the other is this thing that we can never fully comprehend. We don't live in a world in which there's a sense of exclusivity, of things being beyond us. We live in a world in which we don't even have a sense that there's no other time but human time. Everything is kind of operates under like a clockwork efficiency, as opposed to participating in a sense of stillness and narrative continuity with the things around us. It's the human constantly driving forward, constantly operating to its own ends and almost a single track mind. There is no solidity of being, in Han's own words. And so really, in Han's own words again, things give us stability, and around things, memory and history come alive. Again, there's that sense of narrative continuity. Meaning, he says that meaning and coherence are founded on narration. Information is not narration, it's just, he talks about the digital information as being numerical, it's additive, it's free of history and memory, thus it fragments life. Those are the kinds of ideas that Han is working with here. And speaking of work, one of the things that I did find a little bit challenging, or that I disagreed with rather, in this book is that Han seems to be an advocate for the hand, and he uses Heidegger's notion of the hand as opposed to the finger. The hand is the thing that acts and does, whereas the finger is it chooses. It's really a distinction between autonomy in making and being connected with the thing, whereas the finger is has a sense of distance, in that we're choosing. We are freed from a sense of agency, and the in fact a finger, the etymology for the finger, I believe it's digitas, or it relates to the digital. So he makes that connection there. But the main point is that Han wants us to work, to have a sense that we are connected with the materiality of the world, and I do agree with this, but he seems to say that the emancipatory effects of digitalization promise a form of life that resembles play. He actually goes on to say that the human being of the future is no longer interested in things, is not a worker, homo faber, but a player, homo ludens. To be in play is almost has negative consequences, I do understand what he means here, but he seems to almost be operating under a Protestant work ethic here. He's almost in a teleological sense as well, where the human needs to work to gain meaning. Whereas play, for me, play is more like recreation and more like play has so much alliance or allegiance to wonder, in that we're not doing anything, we're contemplating. And I find it quite contradictory, because Han goes on to talk about the value of contemplation and stillness. Play is a form of stillness in a sense. I do know what he means, but he actually says that play does not interfere with reality. I'm not sure I agree with that. He even says that a form of rule in which human beings did nothing but play would be perfect domination. He talks about bread and circuses. In this context, it does make sense, but the idea that we should need to work to gain a sense of meaning, I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, especially in the context of wonder and just appreciating, as opposed to, it almost leans too much towards progress and efficiency for me, what Han is saying here. People were sedated with free food and spectacular games in Roman society. Universal basic income and computer games would be the modern bread and circuses. Something I don't agree with. And related to this, he talks about objects. It's a very common idea, of course, that objects have meaning. We imbue them with a sense of ourselves, and they have a history, a kind of a trajectory that comes to us. We find an old book, and that book might have been held by many hands. And it has a sense of the thing about it, as opposed to the non-thing. Han here talks about the ebook being a non-thing. He says that ebooks reduce a book to informational value. The book has no age, place, craft, or owner. It lacks the auratic distance. He's talking about Walter Benjamin's idea of the aura. It lacks the auratic distance from which an individual fate could speak to us. Fate has no place in the digital order. I just find it hard to get fully on board with what he's saying here. It's just a new bit of technology that allows us to read more. In fact, I got into reading through Kindle. Well, more into reading through Kindle for a variety of reasons. I mean, I do, in fact, somewhat regret reading on Kindle. I don't think devices are as bad as Han is saying. Something that I do agree with, though, in relation to digital communication and devices. He talks about the smartphone placing the world. It takes hold of the world by placing it in front of us in the form of an image. I find that fascinating, because it's that sense of the world isn't this thing external to us, which has a sense of exclusivity and otherness that isn't. We are related to it, but it doesn't. The human doesn't exhaust the world, and so to have a phone that has everything on it, in a sense, in which we're fully attached to a phone. We're looking at it. It places the world as a single image, and that is primarily an anthropocentric world. It's the human image. He actually says that the smartphone is, I suppose, the icon, or the symbol rather, of the human age, of the modern world. And something related to this, which is very, very much in my area of interest, he talks about the sleek and the smooth, our obsession with a lack of resistance. And in particular, he doesn't so much go into architecture here, but he talks about something that I love here. Is he says, the world consists of things as objects. The word object is derived from the Latin verb obesere, which means set against, or throw against, or oppose. The negativity of resistance is inherent in it. And we, in fact, are obsessed with a lack of resistance. We want the smooth, not only in our devices, but in our architecture as well, a particular area of interest for me. He doesn't so much go into architecture in this book, unfortunately, but that's a clear correlation there, or linkage. He says that a society that is dominated by information is unadorned. Adornment originally meant splendid attire. Non-things are naked. The decorative and the ornamental are characteristic of things. I absolutely love that sentence. They are life's way of telling us that life is about more than mere functioning. Absolutely perfect. Lots of interesting detail that I can't quite go into in full depth, I suppose. But Han also talks about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is wholly different from human intelligence. And he says that information and data have no depth. Human thinking is more than computing and problem solving. It brightens and clears the world. It brings forth an altogether other world. The main danger that arises from machine intelligence is that human thinking will adapt to it and itself become mechanical. Again, it's a critique of transhumanism, posthumanism. And something I found interesting is that in relation to that, Han uses Deleuze here, who said that philosophy begins with making oneself an idiot. Thinking is characterized not by intelligence but by idiocy. The philosopher bids farewell to all that went before. In a sense, it's about taking a risk into the unknown, into the altogether other. So again, we can't experience the other, this world around us, if we are actually adapting ourselves to have our thinking be more machine-like, to be like artificial intelligence, which is not how we think. We are becoming more like machines, as opposed to the human animal. There's so much in here. I find that this book is much more varied and kind of textured than Han's other book on the Death Drive. There's a fantastic section called The Villainy of Things, where he's talking about old Mickey Mouse cartoons and the films of Charlie Chaplin as well. There's a sense of materiality being thwarting us in some way, actually being treacherous. I found that fascinating because he says, the villainy of things is now probably a thing of the past. We are no longer maltreated by things. They are not destructive. They do not offer any resistance. The sting has been taken out of them. We do not perceive them in their otherness or as alien. This weakens our feeling for reality. Something about of things having a sense of their own agency, as opposed to fully being dominated and tamed and domesticated by the human. Indeed, he even gives, he contrasts this with the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, which is apparently a new series. He says the representation of material reality is markedly different from that in the earlier episodes. Things no longer have an independent life. They are obedient tools for solving problems. He says that Mickey Mouse, the hero, no longer collides with physical reality. In this way, children are fed the idea that there is nothing that cannot be done, that there is a quick solution, an app for everything, and that life itself is nothing but a series of problems to be solved. Something else that I found very fascinating was the related idea of the reverse of things. And he's talking about Robert Bloch's idea of the reverse of things. He says that Bloch objects to the instrumental treatment of things. He sees human culture as a very fragile institution built on the reverse of things. We know only the front or the right side of their technical subservience, their benign incorporation into our world. But we see neither their underside nor what it all floats in. Again, it's this idea that things aren't for our purpose. They are not things that prop the human up. We need to be wary of the other and their own sense of agency, their own sense of almost perilousness. It's getting very close to the idea of fairy as being an ambivalent realm of enrichment, but also danger. Again, still in the idea that perception is open to the underside and the reverse of things. And he gives the example of Sartre in Sartre's book Nausea, the protagonist of Nausea, almost being afraid of these objects touching him, becomes unbearable. And then Han writes at the bottom of this excerpt here, he says, in Sartre's world, the other still has integrity. The other as gaze is constitutive of the relation to the world. Even the rustling of branches or the slight opening of a shutter or a light movement of a curtain is perceived as a gaze. Today the world is gazeless. It no longer looks at us. The world has lost its otherness. And this idea here as well, I've written perfect beside it in the margins. Very much Korean, I suppose. He says, we cannot enter into a relation with a world that consists exclusively of available consumable objects. It is also impossible to be in relation with information. It is really the relational ontology that gives us a sense of our own being. It gives others a sense of being as well. And Han even goes on to say that a relation requires an independent counterpart, mutuality, a thou, as opposed to the I. It is the I that is becoming more and more dominant in society as opposed to the thou. Only a revitalization of the other could free us of our poverty in world. We have a poverty of world. There's so many things that I gained from this book. I'm just kind of in awe of how much it collects and kind of collates different ideas that I can link to other things. There's a concept in Barth's theory of photography about the studium and the punctum. The punctum being the thing that draws us towards a particular part in a photograph. And I found that it's fascinating because this in the studium is kind of a background that we don't really register, I think, if I understand it correctly. And it's as if the studium is a disenchanting city, a consumerist society. We can then be drawn, if we're so lucky, to the punctum, to an opening in this kind of matrix of disenchantment, I suppose. And another thing that he talks about here is that when one pays more attention to things, this is Han speaking, when one pays more attention to things, one forgets oneself, loses oneself. When the ego gets weaker, it's able to hear that mute thing language. The experience of presence requires exposure, vulnerability. Without a wound, I ultimately hear only the echo of myself. Got goosebumps reading this, which is somewhat rare for a non-fiction book. A wound is an opening, an ear for the other. Openings, wounds, vulnerability, perception of the other, in a kind of homogeny, the studium. There's so much weight to each of the pages in this book. I won't give so much context here, but this is again in relation to Heidegger's hand and the concept of Dasein and care and things like this, which some of you might be aware of. But I'll just summarize this book, I think, with this particular quote or excerpt. Han says that Heidegger's hand is tied to the terrestrial order. Thus it does not grasp the human future. Human beings have long since stopped dwelling between earth and sky. On the way towards the unthinged, they will also leave the mortals and divinities behind. The last things will also have to be eliminated. Human beings soar upwards towards the unthinged, the unconditioned. We are headed towards a transhuman and post-human age in which human life will be a pure exchange of information. Human beings shed their being bethinged, their facticity, even though this is precisely what makes them what they are. Human is derived from humus, that is soil. Digitalization is a resolute step along the way towards the abolition of the humanum. The future of the human seems mapped out. Humans will abolish themselves in order to posit themselves as the absolute. So I will end by reading my favourite section of this book. Han is quoting in part from Mikkel's series. Han begins by saying that the world is polluted not only by excretions and material waste, but also by junk communication and information. It is plastered with advertisements. Everything is crying out for attention on, and this is now Mikkel's series speaking, on a planet completely covered with garbage and billboards. On each mountain rock, each tree leaf, each agricultural plot of land, you have advertisements. Letters are written on each blade of grass. Like the legendary cathedral, the landscape is swallowed by the tsunami of signs. This is Han speaking again. Non-things block out things, pollute them. Junk information and communication destroy the silent landscape, the discrete language of things. And this is now Michael Series speaking again. Imperious images on letters force us to read, while the pleading things of the world are begging our senses for meaning. The latter ask, the former command. Forcing themselves on our perception, those low and facile signs clog up the landscape, which itself is more difficult, discreet, silent, and often dying because unseen by any saving perception. Non-things. I would go so far as to say, along with Curry's book Enchantment, Older Modern Life, that this is now almost a Bible, if I can call it that, for the Otherword channel. Absolutely fantastic. Till next time, everyone. Thanks for watching.